No, I forgot something. He tells the world to prepare for the coming day of the Lord, because the world's going to be a witness to this day. They're going to witness God's judgment. And so in the rest of chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2, God is going to deal with describing that day. I got a question. Have you ever heard people criticize God or question God because of the evil they see in the world, and they wonder, why doesn't God do something about that? Have you heard people, when they've taken stories and passages out of the Old Testament, and where God orders the destruction of certain people, or what we're going to read today about what's going to happen to Judah, and they criticize the God of the Bible for being cruel? You heard that? Isn't that a contradiction? Isn't that a contradiction? People get mad at God because he doesn't do anything, and then they get mad at God when he does do something. That's just something I've noticed in my life. Well, let's start here in Zephaniah chapter 1, starting in verse 14. Excuse me. It says, "The great day of the Lord is near and coming quickly. Listen, the cry on the day of the Lord will be bitter, the shouting of the warriors there." In Zephaniah, he begins in verse 14, stating the great day of the Lord is near. In other words, it's coming soon. It's the same thing as in verse 7, where he said earlier that we looked at last week, "Be silent before the sovereign Lord, for the day of the Lord is near." This is the day, he's saying, you better take notice of this day. What's about to happen is important. There's lessons here you need to learn at this time. He says the day is near and coming quickly. God's patience with Judah's sin is almost up. It's not going to be a good day. And there at the very end of verse 14, it says, excuse me, I got a frog in my throat. It says, "The cry on the day of the Lord will be bitter, the shouting of the warrior there." The New American Standard Version captures better what that means. It says, "In it the warrior cries out bitterly." And what he's saying here, when this day comes and the enemy attacks, the soldiers of Judah, they're going to fight well, they're going to fight gallantly, but they're going to fail. And they're going to cry out because they failed. They couldn't protect the city. It's going to be a day like that. Verse 15. "That day will be a day of wrath, a day of distress and anguish, a day of trouble and ruin, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of cloud and blackness." That going to be a nice day? And that's going to be a day you're going to get on your bathing suit and go out and get a suntan? No. That description is kind of terrifying. And God's judgment here is going to be on full display for the entire world to see. It's going to be a day that will not soon be forgotten. He said it'll be a day of wrath. It's going to be a day of trouble and distress. A day of destruction and desolation. A day of darkness and gloom. A day of clouds and thick darkness. He goes on in verse 16, he says, "A day of trumpet and battle cry against the fortified cities and against the corner towers." It's going to be a day of battle. It's going to be the day that the city of Jerusalem is going to fall to the enemy. Verse 17. He says, "I will bring distress on the people, and they will walk like blind men. Because they have sinned against the Lord, their blood will be poured out like dust, and their entrails like filth. Neither their silver nor their gold will be able to save them. On the day of the Lord's wrath and the fire of his jealousy, the whole world will be consumed. For he will make a sudden end of all who live in the earth." On this day, people are going to realize the folly of their sin. There's not going to be anybody running around saying, God doesn't care. God doesn't see what's going on. Okay? Look how strong we're beyond destruction. In fact, we've read before in some of the other prophets, that's exactly what the people were saying leading up to this time. They think, well, we can just go on living the way we're living. God, what? God hadn't done anything. People today are like that, aren't they? People think, we got plenty of time, don't we? We say Jesus could come back at any time, right? He could come back, before I'm finished today, or he could come back 1,000 or 2,000 years from now. And in our mind, what are we thinking? 1,000 to 2,000 years from now. It's off in the distance. It's something I don't have to worry about today. I don't have to worry about the day of judgment because I got time. That's what a lot of people tell themselves. In reality, we don't have time, do we? Okay. You know what day it is? This is the day to get right with God. And the reason for that is we may not have tomorrow. We're only guaranteed today. How many people woke up Friday? What was there? There was 34 people woke up Friday thinking they had all the time in the world, and they were gone by nightfall because of the tornadoes. You don't know. We don't know. And so today is the day to get ready and to get yourself right with God, because we don't know. But see, that's the way people are think. That's the way people think. God doesn't see. God doesn't know. God doesn't care. God's not coming. And so just go on living the way they live. He says there in verse 16. I'm sorry, verse 17. He says they will walk like blind men because of their sins. When this destruction is going to come so fast and so horrible, it's going to be a shock. Ever seen people in such shock, they just kind of stumble around. They don't know what to do, where to go. Well, that's how they're going to act on that day. They're going to be like blind men. They're going to stumble around, falling over things. On that day, the slaughter's going to be great. He says on verse 18, neither their silver nor their gold will be able to save them. On that day, their wealth that they counted on, that was so important to them, won't be able to save them. They're not going to be able to bribe their way out of this. Again, today, a lot of people depend upon their wealth, don't they? We look at our bank account. Anybody look at their bank account recently? Okay. Probably looked at it in shock or relief. I don't know. But we tend to look at our bank account, don't we? And people with money, they tend to trust in their money to take care of them and protect them and keep life well for them. Well, on this day, Zephaniah is saying their money is going to fail them. It's not going to do them any good. He goes on here. He says about God, in the fire of his jealousy, the whole world will be consumed. He speaks of God's jealousy here. He says that his jealousy is going to consume the world. We like to think when we think about God, we like to think about certain aspects of God, don't we? What do we usually like to think about when we think about God? His love. Yeah. What else? His goodness. What else? His what? His faith. What else? Okay, the giving of eternal life. Doing good things for us, right? You know what God says about himself? He says he's a jealous God. And here Zephaniah is speaking of his jealousy. Look in Exodus 34. Exodus 34, verse 12. God here is speaking to the people, to the Jews, and he says, In verse 12, be careful not to make a treaty with those who live in the land where you are going, or they will be a snare among you. They'll break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, and cut down their Asherah poles. Do not worship any other god. He tells them why here. For the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Do we like to think about God being jealous? You know, we don't like being around jealous people, do we? Okay? Why don't we like being around jealous people? What is it about them that we don't like? What's that? It's all about them. Yeah, that's a big thing. It's all about them. What else? Loretta, you want to say something? Yeah, they're very selfish. Yes, ma'am. They're very controlling, aren't they? You know, if you're the object of their jealousy, they're very controlling, and they try to really restrict you and monitor you, and it's suffocating, isn't it? Well, how do you feel about God saying he's a jealous God? Okay. See, here's the difference in a jealous man and our jealous God. The jealous man, his jealousy, as somebody pointed out, is selfish. It's all about him. God's jealousy is for us. He knows what's best for us. He wants the best for us. And he knows he's the best for us. And so when he sees us running after the things that are going to hurt us, it arouses his jealousy. Look in Deuteronomy chapter 4. And I like what he says there in Deuteronomy 34. Exodus 34. He says, I'm so jealous, my name is jealous. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 23. He says in verse 23, he says, be careful not to forget the covenant of the Lord your God that he made with you. Do not make for yourselves an idol in the form of anything the Lord your God has forbidden. For your Lord your God is a consuming fire, a jealous God. See, that's how God wants us so bad. He says he's a consuming fire. And if you go back to Zephaniah chapter 1, there in verse 18, it says, in the fire of his jealousy, the whole world is consumed. God created man. You know, we wear the image of God. You want to know why man is so special? The image of God is within us. And that's special. It tells you just how valuable you are. You know, value is determined by what someone will pay for an item. You know, if you're having something you're wanting to sell, if you're wanting to sell your car and you want $20,000 for it, but no one will give you $20,000, that car's not worth $20,000. It might only be worth $5,000. That's all people will pay for you. God placed a price tag on us. Did you know that? It was the price of his son. He paid his son for us. See, that's what his jealousy drove him to do. He wants us so bad. He took the most precious thing he had, his son, and he gave it for us. Next time you're feeling worthless, think about that. See, we live in a world that tries to tell us we're worthless. We live in a world that tries to tell us we're nothing but a hairless monkey. We're no better than any of the other animals out there. And you know that you hear that enough times, and it starts to affect the way you feel about yourself. But God says, you're so valuable to me, I gave the most precious thing I had for you, my son. And we need to feel and understand our value, that we're worth a lot to God. He says there at the very end of verse 18, for He will make a sudden end of all who live in the world. God's judgment is coming. Somebody said this. I really liked it. He said the destruction, and he's speaking of this section right here in Zephaniah. He said this destruction would be accomplished by the fire of Jehovah's jealousy, for he is a consuming fire. Jehovah's jealousy is his righteous resentment and indignation at being supplanted in the affections of his people by empty idols and having his righteousness exchanged for pagan wickedness. And see, that's what we do. You know, God made us glorious. And we've sold that so cheaply in this life. And that's what arouses his jealousy. I think he looks at us today, and I'm sure his jealousy is aroused today because of the way we treat him and the way we run after other things instead of him. We're in chapter 2. Starting here in chapter 2, he's still talking about the coming destruction, but he has a change right here. It's like he's giving one last plea. He's saying, all this is coming, but maybe there's a chance we can turn it back. Maybe if we just do this, we can turn it back. He says in verse 1 and 2, he says, gather together, O shameful nation. Before the appointed time arise and that day sweeps on like chaff, before the fierce anger of the Lord comes upon you, before the day of the Lord's wrath comes upon you. Here Zephaniah, he's calling the nation together. He says, come, let's gather together. Let's talk about this one last time before it's too late. Let's talk about this before God's judgment gets here. At this moment in time, God's judgment wasn't there. Okay? But it's coming. And he's saying, maybe we can revert this. He calls her a shameful nation. He's saying, you guys need to understand what you've been doing in this. You know, today, like I said earlier, today is the day for us to get our lives right with God. God's judgment is coming. It's not here yet, but it's coming. And today is the day we need to get things ready. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. I mean, it does start now. We're sometimes we don't realize it because we're still living in this world. Okay? But God has begun the blessings now. He began the blessing on the day that we were baptized into Christ. And they culminate in heaven. And the Bible says we can't even imagine what's waiting for us up there. But we do get a little taste of it here. You know, the church gives us a little taste. When the church functions the way the church is supposed to function, it's a blessing in this life. And God has given us each other for that. Verse 3. He calls the nation together. Verse 2. He calls the nation together in verse 1. And again, he says, before the appointed time arrives. He's saying, before it's too late, guys, let's get our act together. And he says in verse 3, he says, seek the Lord, all you humble of the land, you who do what he commands, Seek righteousness, seek humility. Perhaps you will be sheltered on the day of the Lord's anger. He says, seek these three things. Seek the Lord, seek his righteousness, seek humility. Humble yourself before God. Make these things the priorities. See, these are the things that God wanted from his people. And by the way, they did have a moment of this. Zephaniah wrote during the reign of King Josiah. And they believe that this was written before Josiah, the law was discovered in the temple. And the law was discovered, and Josiah, when he read it, he tore his clothes and repented before God. And he led the nation in coming back to God. He went around destroying the places of idol worship and calling people back to repent. And God relented for a moment his judgment, if you remember. We talked about this a few weeks ago. He relented in his judgment. He said, Josiah, because you humbled yourself before me and repented, I'm not going to bring this judgment on the nation during your lifetime. It's still coming, Josiah, but you're not going to see it. And see, God was that way because God knew man. And he knew, Josiah was a good man. He was a good king. But once he was gone, they were going to just go right back into idolatry. And that's exactly what happened. But God did relent for a while. He said to them, perhaps you will be sheltered. The only hope that they had at this moment was to throw themselves at the mercy of God. And maybe there'd still be room for God's grace. Because, see, they deserved what was coming. But maybe if they repented before God, he would spare them. Okay, he now turns, starting in verse 4, he now turns from talking about Judah. This is the thing about God. God was not just the God of the Jews. We tend to think that as we read the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, God was only concerned about the Jews. God was concerned about the other nations too. The people of the other nations, whose image did they bear? They bear the image of God too. He cared about them. That's why he chose he chose the Jews not because he loved them more than the other nations. He chose the Jews because he had a plan to save the nations. He chose the Jews because he was going to bring his son. And so he still cared about all the people and all these other nations. And so now he's going to turn his attention to them because he's got some things to say to them at this point in time. And the first nation he turns his eyes to is the Philistines, Philistia. Philistia was a nation on the coastal plain of southwest Canaan, which is today most of it is Gaza. We all know Gaza's in the news right now. You want to know where it's at? But they were under the control, that area was under the control of the Philistines. The exact background of the Philistines is kind of muddied. They appear to be part of what was called the Sea People. The Sea People, before this time, had invaded along the coast of the Mediterranean. They invaded Egypt, and they're along Canaan. And they believe that's where the Philistines came from. They invaded around 1200 BC. It's believed that they're from tribes that originated in other parts of the Mediterranean Sea, and they immigrated over. And here, the Philistines, they set up a confederation of 5 cities. Gath, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Ekron. And those 5 cities made up what we can call the Confederation of the Philistines. It was a loose-knit confederation that they cooperated with each other, kind of like the Greek city-states did. Greece was never one nation. It was different city-states, and they cooperated with one another. When Zephaniah wrote this, one of the cities, Gath, had already been destroyed by the Assyrians. So there's only 4 cities left, and so the Gath is not mentioned by Zephaniah here. Let's look again. Let's read verse 4. He said, Gaza will be abandoned, and Ashkelon left in ruins. At midday, Ashdod will be emptied, and Ekron uprooted. Okay? He lists the 4 cities that we mentioned. He says they're going to be destroyed. He goes on in verse 5. Woe to you who live by the sea, O Kirathite people. The word of the Lord is against you, O Canaan, land of the Philistines. I will destroy you, and none will be left. He begins here, verse 5, with the woe. And we've talked about that before. Whenever a verse starts with woe, that's not a good thing, is it? He says, the word of the Lord was against them. He refers to the Kirathites. There's another word, and I'm not going to try and pronounce it because I butchered that one, okay, that you might see in your translation. That was just another name for the Philistines. It believes that it is reference to the island of Crete because apparently some of the Philistines had come from Crete, and so that's what they believe that word comes from. But the bottom line of verse 4 is that God was going to totally destroy them. Verse 6, the land by the sea where the Kirathites dwell will be a place for shepherds and sheep pens. He says in verse 7, it will belong to the remnants of the house of Judah. They will find pasture. In the evening they will lie down. In the houses of Ashkelon, the Lord their God will care for them. He will restore their fortune. In verse 6, he says the land is going to be inhabitable. It's only going to be good for shepherds and their flock. And there in verse 7, he says he's going to give the land to Judah. He's referring there to the remnant that's going to come back from captivity after the Babylonian captivity. It'll be part of the blessing that God is going to bestow on the remnant when they return. Verse 8. Now he's turning his attention to the 2 nations of Moab and Ammon. He says, I've heard the insults of Moab and the taunts of the Amorites who insulted my people and made threats against their land. Therefore, as surely as I live, declares the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, surely Moab will become like Sodom and the Ammonites like Gomorrah, a place of weeds and salt pits, a wasteland forever. The remnant of my people will plunder them. The survivors of my nation will inherit their land. This is what their pride gets in return for this is what they get in return for their pride, for insulting and mocking the people of the Lord Almighty. The Lord will be awesome to them when he destroys all the gods of the land. The nations on every shore will worship him, everyone in his own land. Moab and Ammon were nations to the east of Judah. Anybody know where they came from, where their ancestry comes from? It comes from Lot. Okay, remember Lot? Lot was Abraham's nephew. So what does that make these people to the Jews? What does that make them? Long distant cousins. Okay, they're distant relatives of the Jews. And they have a history with each other. When the Israelites were led out of Egypt and they were wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, they wanted to cross the land of Moab, and the Moabites didn't want them to do that. So the king of Moab, he's the one that went and hired Balaam. Remember the story of Balaam and his donkey? He went and hired Balaam to come and curse them, and instead of cursing them, he ended up blessing them. Throughout their history, the Moabites and the Ammonites invaded and attacked the Jews. The Moabites would ridicule the Jews, and they would celebrate when bad things happen to them. In fact, when Jerusalem falls, they're going to be out dancing in the streets at the fall of Jerusalem. Verse 8, though, God lets them know nothing gets by him. He says, I've heard the insults of Moab and the taunts of the Ammonites, who insulted my people and made threats against the land. See, God is saying, I see what you're doing. I hear what you're up to. I hear the words coming out of your mouth. We need to remember that today, don't we? In Isaiah chapter 6, Isaiah 16, verse 6, Isaiah wrote this. He said, we heard of Moab's pride, her overweening pride and conceit, her pride and her insolent, but her boasts are empty. And Jeremiah said that the Moabites had magnified herself against the Lord. Think about that. They magnified. What does that mean? They magnified themselves against the Lord. They made themselves greater, didn't they? In that. Okay? And I'd read the verse, but it's not a nice verse that Jeremiah said. But basically he's talking about how, that's the pride of men that he's talking about there. Verse 9. Therefore, as surely as I live, declares the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, surely Moab will become like Sodom, and the Ammonites like Gomorrah, a place of weeds and salt pits, a wasteland forever. The remnant of my people will plunder them. The survivors of my nation will inherit the land. God here puts emphasis on this verse because he swears by himself. As surely as I live, this is going to happen. He declares the complete destruction of Moab and Ammon. He said, I'm going to do to them as I did to Sodom and Gomorrah. Remember those two cities, don't you? Their homeland, he says, is going to become a wasteland. But it's interesting here that he used Sodom and Gomorrah because they play so significantly in the story of their descendant Lot, who they came from. Remember what happened with Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah? Lot lived in Sodom, and the angels came to him and warned him to leave because God was going to destroy these two cities for their wickedness. He didn't want to, but they finally convinced him to leave, and he left. His wife, they said, don't look back, and his wife looked back and said she turned into a pillar of salt. And afterwards, he had the relationship with his two daughters, and that's where Moab and Ammon came from, and those two nations came from them. It's interesting that he connects that story here to these nations. And so while God would destroy them, he's telling them God's people would go on. Verse 10 says, this is what they will get in return for their pride, for insulting and mocking the people of the Lord Almighty. He said they're going to get what they deserve. God doesn't do things haphazard. There's reason behind what he's doing here. And he's punishing these nations for their sin. He said the Lord, in verse 11, the Lord will be awesome to them. When he destroys all the gods of the land, the nations on every shore will worship him, every one in its own land. God is saying the future is mine. He says he's going to be awesome to them. The idea of awesome in the New Testament is not a good thing all the time. When God says, I'm going to be awesome to someone, that's not a good thing. And for the Moabites, that's not a good thing. Okay? Psalms 47, 2-3 says this. How awesome is the Lord Most High, the great King over all the earth. He subdues nations under us, peoples under our feet. See, the defeat of Moab and Ammon was a demonstration of his awesome superiority over their pagan gods. See, that's a lot of these pagan nations, that's who they trusted in. They trusted in their gods. And they saw the conflicts going on, was conflicts between their gods and with them being the pawns that the gods were using. But God is showing each one of them who really is the most awesome of all of them, isn't he? Okay? He said he's going to destroy the idolatry of the nations. He ends up here at the very end. He said, I'm going to be worshipped in every nation. See, that's what God is doing. God is showing the world who he is. There is none other like him. He is greater than all the other so-called gods in this world. But the amazing thing about his awesomeness is just how much he loves mankind. It may not sound like it here, but really there's a lot of love behind it, because God really cares for mankind. He really wants to save mankind. But we have a tendency to corrupt ourselves, don't we? We have a tendency to rebel against God, don't we? And God has to show, his awesomeness to us. And that's what he's doing to these nations. He's showing them who he is in this. Then he turns to Cush in verse 12, just one verse. He says, you too, O Cushites, will be slain by the sword. Cush, you may know where Cush is. Yeah, it's modern day Ethiopia. And you might wonder, why is he picking on Ethiopia here? For years, Egypt was ruled by the Ethiopian king. So when he's talking about Cush here, he's also including Egypt into this. And he's prophesying the downfall of Cush, and which includes Egypt too. And that brings us now to the Assyrians. Verse 13. He says in verse 13, he will stretch out his hand against the north and destroy Assyria, leaving Nineveh utterly desolate and dry as the desert. Flocks and herds will lie down there, creatures of every kind. The desert owl and the screech owl will roost on her columns. Their call will echo throughout the windows. Rubble will be in the doorways. The beams of cedar will be exposed. This is the carefree city that lived in safety. She said to herself, I am, and there is none beside me. What a ruin she will become, a lair for wild beasts. All who pass by her scoff and shake their fists. We get back to the big bully on the block, so to speak, Assyria. At one time, Assyria was on the verge of conquering the known earth. They had destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel. They'd made it all the way to the gates of Jerusalem, destroying all the other cities of Jerusalem until God turned them back at the gates of Jerusalem. In verse 13 and 14, God says that their nation will be utterly destroyed. He says he will stretch out his hand against the north and destroy Assyria, leaving Nineveh utterly desolate and dry as the desert. Flocks and herds will lie down, creatures of every kind. The desert owl and the screech owl will roost on her column. Their call will echo through the windows. Rubble will be in their doorway, and beams of cedar will be exposed. Boy, there's going to be nothing left, is there, in that? Nineveh was considered at the time the world's power. They were the United States of their age. They thought they were invincible. But before God, no one's invincible, are they? In that. It says Nineveh has become like a desert. You know what? You know what's in Nineveh today? Ruins. That's all that's there. The city is gone. There's nothing left. And, at this time, they were prosperous. They were powerful. They dominated their world. But when God acts, it doesn't matter. That's why it's good to have God on your side, by the way. You don't want God on the other side. You don't. In verse 15, God gives his reason for his judgment on Assyria. Do you see what it is? Look at verse 15. What's his reason for his judgment on them? What's that? They're arrogant. Pride. Isn't that the problem with man? Is our pride? They were boastful. They believed themselves to be untouchable. They saw the future, so they thought, and the future belonged to them. They believed they were safe from all harm. Did you hear what they said? She said to herself, get this, I am, and there is none beside me. What does that sound like? That sounds like they're claiming to be God, doesn't it? I am, and there's none beside me. I think we've heard God say that, haven't we? See, they think they're God. And so they're going to come, their downfall is going to be because of their pride. Today, like I said, Nineveh is in ruin. The once proud city is desolate. No one lives there today. And that's what happened when you get prideful towards God. That's a warning for us today. That's a warning as a nation why we should keep our eyes on God and not turn from him. Unfortunately, as a nation, we're turning as fast as we can from God, and we should probably take some of these warnings we read about seriously ourselves today. You know, the Old Testament is there for a purpose. It's there for our learning. We learn about God, and we learn about ourselves in the Old Testament. Man has not changed, and God has not changed in that. So I would say we better take that to heart. We're going to end here now. We'll pick up chapter 3 next week.